In 1965, Singapore's founding prime minister wept on live television. Lee Kuan Yew had just announced that Singapore was expelled from Malaysia. The young nation had no army, no natural resources, and almost no industry. Singapore's GDP per capita was roughly $500 in 1965, one of the lowest in Asia. Most development economists gave the country a generation before it collapsed. Today, Singapore ranks among the top 10 wealthiest nations on Earth, by GDP per capita. The IMF's April 2026 World Economic Outlook projects Singapore's nominal GDP per capita at approximately $107,000. Singapore achieved this without a single oil well, without iron ore deposits, and without significant agricultural land. The question worth asking is not just how Singapore got rich, but why almost no other country has replicated the formula. Singapore sits on a peninsula at the southern tip of the Malay archipelago, covering just 733 square kilometers. The entire country is roughly 3 times the size of Washington, D.C. Singapore lacks rivers large enough for hydroelectric power and imports most of its drinking water from Malaysia. When British colonial rule ended, Singapore joined the Malaysian Federation in 1963, hoping for economic protection. 2 years later, political tensions between Singapore's Chinese majority and Malaysia's Malay political leadership forced a separation that neither side actually wanted. Lee Kuan Yew described the expulsion as a moment of anguish. The global consensus in 1965 was that Singapore faced near certain economic failure. Singapore's leadership made 3 foundational decisions in the first decade of independence. The first decision was to build a corruption-free civil service and pay government officials competitive private sector salaries. Singapore retained the world's 3rd place on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index in 2025 for the 2nd consecutive year. The second decision was to treat foreign investment not as a threat, but as the primary engine of growth. Singapore offered foreign multinationals tax incentives, legal protections, and a disciplined workforce trained specifically for manufacturing. Within 10 years, companies like Texas Instruments and Hewlett-Packard had built major facilities in Singapore. The third decision was to invest aggressively in human capital, making education the country's primary national resource. Singapore's founding philosophy treated every citizen as an economic asset that the government had a duty to develop. Singapore's port became the physical engine of early growth. The Strait of Malacca carries roughly 40% of global seaborne trade, and Singapore sits directly at its eastern entrance. Port infrastructure was expanded, modernized, and managed with state precision throughout the 1970s and 1980s. By 2024, the Port of Singapore handled a then-record 41.12 million 20-foot equivalent container units, confirmed by the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore. Singapore's port then broke that record in 2025, reaching 44.66 million TEUs, an 8.6% year-on-year increase. Port revenue alone, however, does not explain Singapore's wealth. Singapore deliberately used the port as a launchpad to build finance, pharmaceuticals, and high technology on top of logistics. Here is the part of Singapore's story that challenges conventional economic thinking. Singapore is routinely described as a model of free market capitalism. The World Bank ranks Singapore among the easiest places on Earth to do business. But the Singapore government owns the national airline, the largest telecommunications company, and major portions of the banking sector through a state holding company called Temasek Holdings. Temasek was incorporated in 1974 with initial government assets to manage state-owned enterprises on commercial principles. Singapore also operates GIC, a sovereign wealth fund estimated at $936 billion in assets under management as of March 2025. GIC makes Singapore one of the largest sovereign wealth fund operators on the planet. The Singapore government owns and manages almost all land in the country, leasing rather than selling it to developers and citizens. Approximately 77% of Singaporeans live in public housing built and managed by the Housing Development Board, a government agency. Yet, these apartments are traded on open markets, hold their value, and represent genuine personal wealth for most families. Singapore built a system where heavy state control and genuine market competition coexist. A combination that has no clean ideological label. Singapore's Central Provident Fund adds another layer to this picture. Every working Singaporean contributes a significant share of their salary into a mandatory savings scheme called the CPF. Employers also contribute, bringing total CPF contributions to 37% of wages for workers aged 55 and under. These savings fund retirement, healthcare, and housing. But the government also uses CPF balances to finance national infrastructure. Singapore turned mandatory savings into a sovereign financing mechanism, funding development without accumulating foreign debt. This model effectively forces household saving at a national scale, a policy no purely free market economy would implement. The counter-argument to Singapore's model is straightforward. It required conditions almost impossible to replicate elsewhere. Singapore operates as a city-state, meaning a single government controls urban planning, education, housing, ports, and fiscal policy without regional political resistance. Lee Kuan Yew's People's Action Party governed Singapore for decades without losing power, enabling consistent long-term policy across generations. Critics argue that Singapore's governance model limits political freedoms in ways democracies cannot and should not replicate. Singapore's Press Freedom Index ranks poorly compared to its economic rankings. The country sits near the bottom third globally for media freedom. The Singapore model raises a genuine question that economists still debate. Can authoritarian efficiency and market prosperity be disentangled? Singapore's economic story in 2026 offers a new chapter worth watching. Singapore's economy grew by 6.0% year-on-year in the first quarter of 2026, according to Singapore's Ministry of Trade and Industry. Analysts link that growth largely to Singapore's positioning in artificial intelligence infrastructure and semiconductor manufacturing. Singapore did not discover oil. Singapore became the infrastructure through which other economies run. That is perhaps the most transferable lesson from the Singapore model. In a world where trade flows and capital flows are the real resources, controlling the infrastructure those flows pass through is worth more than controlling the ground beneath your feet. A country with no oil, no iron, and no farmland built one of the most resilient economies in modern history. Singapore did it through meritocracy, strategic geography, disciplined governance, and a form of state capitalism the world still struggles to categorize. The next World Stages video asks a related question. Why do countries with enormous natural wealth, like Venezuela or Nigeria, end up poorer than countries with nothing? The answer involves something economists call the resource curse, and it turns everything you think about natural wealth upside down. If you want to understand how the global economy actually works, not how textbooks say it works, subscribe to World Stages. New videos drop regularly on economic systems, financial structures, and the forces shaping nations. Now, here is a question for the comments. If Singapore's model requires a city-state and a strong central government to work, is there any part of the Singapore playbook that larger, messier democracies could actually borrow?